The world's population will hit 8 billion people on or about November 15th, according to estimates from the United Nations. And for some observers, that's bad news, a sign of the world's dangerous overpopulation. But our next guest doesn't share that doom and gloom attitude about growing population. Marian Tupy is senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and he's co-author of the book titled Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we see this big milestone coming up, 8 billion people. And for a lot of people, it's a sign of a pending doom. We have too many people on this planet and they're consuming too many resources. Why are they wrong?
Well, doomsters have been around for a very long time. There is always somebody running around the world saying the world is nigh, the end is nigh. But just consider one statistic. At the time of the Jefferson presidency in 1800, there was 1 billion people in the world. As you noted, on November the 15th, it will be 8 billion. What happened to our standards of living? Globally, they're 12 times higher, adjusted for inflation, and in the United States, 24 times higher, adjusted for inflation. So clearly, the massive expansion of the world's population went hand in hand with tremendous increases in standards of living. How is that possible? In the book, we argue that every additional human being that's born into the world is born not just with an empty stomach, but also with a pair of hands, and more importantly, with a brain capable of coming up with new ideas, which they can turn into inventions, innovations, productivity gains, new technologies that then lead to improvements in the standards of living.
I think one reason why people have a hard time buying this argument is they see that we have an Earth. It's not getting bigger. It has a certain amount of stuff on it. And at some point, they think this stuff, whatever the material is going to run out, and it will run out as we have more and more people. But your book makes the argument that it's not just the stuff, the material that we need to be paying attention to, but what people are doing with it, correct?
That's right. So the world has exactly the same amount of atoms on it, be it of zinc or copper or tin or whatever, as the Stone Age man had millions of years ago. And yet our standards of living are much higher. So the difference between standards of living of people today and people a million years ago is not really the amount of raw materials, but the knowledge which we bring to use the resources that we already have. And even though the world really has only a finite number of atoms, we can create almost infinite, perhaps even infinite amount of value from it. Just consider something like a grain of sand. It's been lying around for billions of years. Then about 3,500 years ago, people figured out that by heating sand to about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, you could turn it into glass beads, then glass jars. Then sometimes later, we started using glass for window panes, which now dominate the skylines of advanced economies. And currently, we are using sand or glass in fiber optic cables, which transfer trillions of dollars worth of information from one corner of the world to the next. And with every step of this way, the value which we got from a grain of sand has increased. And who knows what sand will be used in 200 years' time or 2,000 years' time. It boggles the mind. But the point is that actually, you can get infinite value from a finite number of atoms. All that you need is more knowledge. And to create more knowledge, you basically need more people.
All of this is very interesting, but there are also some real public policy implications here, aren't there? Because there are a lot of people who do have this fear about overpopulation, who would like to see new sorts of development restrictions or things that really do constrain our ability to grow. And that could have implications for our ability to meet these future challenges, right?
Yes, certainly. We are not telling parents how many children they should have. They should have as many children as they want. But to the extent that they are concerned about the world running out of stuff, The book is meant to show you that that's not true. So if you are concerned about this particular aspect of environmental doom and gloom, the message of the book is you don't really have to worry about that. But we do know from public opinion polls that large sections of people on the planet are refusing to have children on the basis of environmental concerns. And it is to those people that this book is primarily dedicated. Now, we could be looking at problems in the future if fewer children, we are going to hit a peak population in around 2060, and after that it's going to start declining, and that's going to have consequences for a lot of things. The United States government has committed $100 trillion to future generations in terms of unfunded liabilities, things like healthcare and Social Security. Somebody will have to pay for it. If there are fewer Americans, we have a problem. We also have a $30 trillion debt that we have accumulated. Somebody will have to pay for it. If you have fewer people, their taxes will have to go up. And finally, if the world's population declines dramatically, then you could have a problem with maintaining economic growth. In other words, future generations will be living in a world with much less growth than the current generation has, or the generation before that.
One of the other implications I could see is that you've mentioned that the key advantage here of having more people is that you have more intellect, more knowledge that will be able to come up with these solutions. That to me suggests that we also need to be in a position where we're allowing this intellect to flourish and not putting people in positions where they're not being able to learn and being able to come up with these great ideas. We need to have a lot more openness in terms of people being able to learn the types of things they'll need to learn to help them come up with these advances.
That's absolutely right. So population is important, but it is not the only thing which is important. It is the necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for prosperity. If it were, then China, which has been the most populous country in the world for the last 2,000 years, would have been always prosperous. But that's not the case. China has become prosperous only after they allowed for a modicum of political freedom after 1978. So the other component of its population, but you also need freedom. It is only people who are free to speak, to think, to publish, to associate, people who are able to invest in their innovations and profit from them in the market, that you can get this marvelous engine of economic productivity and growth and increased standards of living going. It has to be both.
So you have already mentioned that one of the key messages here is to the people who are afraid of population growth, saying, look, history shows that you don't need to be. But I would guess one of the other messages would be that we need to continue this march toward freedom, both political freedom and economic freedom, because that has to go along with our growth in population.
That's right. I mean, even in a situation where you have a flatlining population or slightly decreasing population, if you can compensate for that by having more people live in freedom, then you are still getting ahead. You can still maintain your growth rate. And of course, part of the problem with economic growth today is that there are only really very few areas of the world where people are free to think, to invest, to profit, and so on. I mean, it's mostly Western world, advanced economies, and parts of Asia. Large chunks of the world, like Africa, for example, are still not really fully a part of the global economy. So if you can increase the amount of human freedom in the world, then that is for the better. If the future is one which is dominated by both population decline and also decline in freedom, then of course our economic growth rate will reflect that.
Before we wrap up, there was a somewhat famous bet some years ago between someone who was optimistic about population, someone pessimistic, and saying, look, let's look at resources and how much they're going to cost years from now. And the optimists ended up winning. Are you looking for someone to take a similar bet with you about where things will stand 20, 30 years from now?
We don't have time to get into this, but your viewers and listeners can, of course, look up the famous Simon Ehrlich bet or Simon Ehrlich wager online. But yes, we are definitely up for having a bet about the future availability of resources. If anybody wants to wager us, we can have a bet with us arguing that over the next 10 or 20 years, in spite of population growth, we are going to have prices of resources that are going to decline.
Once again, the book is titled Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet. Its co-author is Marian Tupy. He is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.